Hello, welcome. I am so excited for everyone who will be joining. My name is Inaru Melendez. I'm the Senior Communications Manager at Hispanics in Philanthropy. We're so excited to be joined by our wonderful guests from Puerto Rico. I want to just announce a few housekeeping items to get us started. There is going to be interpretation, of course, in Spanish available. If you're joining us by Zoom, you'll see a little button on the bottom that should make it available. It's titled Interpretation of Languages en español y interpretación. Para esta conversación, en la parte de abajo de Zoom verás que hay un botoncito que dice interpretación de idioma y puedes escoger la opción en español. Before I continue, I want to just make sure everyone has access to finding this wonderful book that we're going to be talking about today. You'll see it throughout our conversation, linked below and also in the chat. It's called Mi María, Surviving the Storm, Voices from Puerto Rico. The bit.ly is bit.ly/mi-María. And if you're joining us on social media as well, or after this conversation, feel free to join in the conversation. We want to make it open. And if you have any feedback or have questions, feel free to use the hashtag #MiMaria and tag BHipGive, as well as Voice of Witness, who is one of our publishers for the book. On September 20th, 2017, about a week and 4 years ago, Hurricane María pummeled Puerto Rico for over 30 hours. And before I even continue, I just want to take a few seconds to take a moment of silence for our community and the official number, according to Harvard, 4,645 lives lost and affected after the hurricane. So just take a few seconds. Thank you. I wanted to make it brief because I know we have so much to dig into, but I also wanted to acknowledge this moment in our community. So as brutal as the storm was, the real catastrophe was yet to come. Lack of government support left many in Puerto Rico without housing, electricity, clean water, food, or medical care for months. Years later, Puerto Rico is still in recovery. The book we're discussing today, Mi María, Surviving the Storm, brings together 17 stories of perseverance and community that asks us what it means to be a US citizen in a colonial context, how communities come together in the wake of disaster, and how precarity is exacerbated for those on the front line of the climate crisis. Today, we have two wonderful speakers that are going to be joining us in conversation. First is Dr. Ricia Anchansky. She's a professor in the English department at the University of Puerto Rico in Mayagüez, and she's also the co-editor of Mi María, Surviving the Storm. She's been recognized for her work directing this, the book that started off as a large-scale humanities project. She actually won the MLA Innovation in Humanities Award and the Oral History Association's Post-Secondary Teaching Award, and was selected as a partner in the Humanities Action Lab. I'm going to let her introduce herself in a second, but just a quick also introduction to Zaira Arvelo Alicea. She's a narrator in Mi María Surviving the Storm, and actually collaborated as the curriculum specialist for the project. She's a writer, educator, with a focus in English language learners and equity in the continental US and in Puerto Rico. She was born in Lares, Puerto Rico, a mountainous town in the archipelago with a tradition of anti-colonial insurgency. And once again, you can read Mi María Surviving the Storm Voices from Puerto Rico in the bit.ly that should be somewhere below me right now or in the chat. But I'd love to pass the mic over to Ricia to give us a little bit more of an introduction of herself and kind of how this project started. Ricia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Inaru, and thank you for hosting us today, and thank you to Hispanics in Philanthropy for your enthusiastic support of this book. We appreciate it very much. As Inaru said, I'm a professor in the Department of English at the University of Puerto Rico at Mayagüez, and our courses resumed on October 30th, 2017, just over a month after the hurricane. And as a person who studies autobiographical narratives, the ways in which we tell the stories of our lives, I thought that I would invite students to share brief hurricane memoirs as a way to transition back into the work of the course. At that time, we still did not have electricity. It would be long months until our electricity and internet was restored. And so I received almost 100 hurricane memoirs written on paper with pencil or pen. And I read them by candlelight as we were cooking a meal for ourselves and approximately 20 other people on a camp stove. I'm not sure what I expected those narratives would say, but what I didn't expect is that they would talk about people holding on to each other as the roofs of their homes were peeled off and flown into the wind, as every possession that a person owned flew out after the roof. I did not expect the number of times that the words screaming and crying would be repeated. Finally, I came to the narrative of Alejandra, one of my students from Aguadilla. And Alejandra told me that the saddest part of her life was watching her neighbors dig 2 graves in their yard because 2 family members could not receive routine medical care because the electricity remained off and the hospital remained closed. At that point, I wanted to do something for my students. I didn't know what it was, but I wanted them to feel strong and empowered and that they had the potential to do something in the wake of so much disaster. And so I contacted Voice of Witness. I was working in a cafe in the plaza of my town at that time. That's where there was a mobile hotspot. That's where there was a generator. That's where there was running water. And very kindly, they let me work there. I contacted Voice of Witness, which is an organization that believes in social justice through the power of stories, through the power of witnessing. And I created a partnership, very luckily worked on a collaboration with Voice of Witness, in which myself and my colleague Jocelyn Heliga Vargas trained 100 undergraduate students in the ethical collection, transcription, translation, and editing of oral histories. At the same time, my co-editor Marcy Denisak and I were traveling throughout the Puerto Rican archipelago to the mountains of Adjuntas, to the island municipio of Culebra, to La Perla, an art center that was feeding its community. And we were collecting additional narratives. What we were looking at in the project was the failures of government relief. But what we were also looking at in the project is the way that individuals stood up and became heroes in their community.
Thank you, Ricia. That That was very powerful. And thank you for also mentioning the power of voice of witness, collaborating on an incredible, what started as an incredible healing moment for your students and for I'm assuming all of the faculty as well at the University of Mayagüez.
Thank you.
Yeah. So now I would love for Zaira to introduce herself. I know that the genesis of this book could have not been as strong and as robust, including the educational component that kind of has developed afterwards. So Zaira, I'm passing the mic to you.
My name is Zaira Arvelo Alicea, and as Inaru mentioned in the beginning, I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, so I consider myself full-blown Puerto Riqueña, right? And right after all the things that we experienced during the hurricane, and I wouldn't say right, but this must have been by early 2018 when we were finally having more stable communication. Ricia reached out, and I'm the kind of person who expresses herself through writing and through the word. And I had already published the column, but as you know, columns are very limited. I had published one in the Huffington Post where I shared some of the things that had happened to me and were happening still in Puerto Rico. These were the times when we would hear perhaps that 10% of the island had power, or maybe 15 or 20 had water. And there was even a list of the towns where you could go to get money out of an ATM. There were a list of the banks that were open for you to retrieve $20, $50, and that's it, in a moment when there's no other way for you to retrieve money. So my idea was, of course, to share my story, but also to bring forth some of the things that were happening on the island. And when Ricia contacted me in 2018, there was a chance to tell a lengthier story. What surprised me the most, I guess, about the interview and the way that the book is formatted is that voice of witness follows a methodology that's birth to now, meaning the interview didn't start with tell me about September the 20th, or tell me about how you escaped your home, or tell me about the shelter. It's tell me about you. Who is Zaira and who is this person? And that's precisely how every story is structured. So it's not, as we say, a type of fetishism on, just let's bring trauma and let's just speak of sad stories, but it's a very well-rounded type of book, which I think is worth mentioning for people who may be saying, do I want to keep reading about trauma and reading about these horrible climate change things that had happened, in 2017. And in my case, I believe my story is a perfect example on how you can prepare the best you can, or the best you know how. And there is no way to combat Mother Nature, and there is no way to anticipate climate change. In our case, we had no bodies of water close by, no rivers, no oceans, no dams, nothing. And we still had over 6 feet of water inside our house. And that doesn't include, of course, the amount of water that was at ground level outside the house, since our house is almost like a second story place, meaning the amount of precipitation we received from Maria, and all of the water that was coming from every direction decided to converge there. And had it not been because we kept our cool, and because we had an air mattress to float on for many, many hours, we would have drowned in our own house. So certainly this was a story we wanted to share. And by we, I mean my husband and I, more myself than him. And later the opportunity arose as well to serve as curriculum designer. So the book had a larger purpose than sitting, perhaps, as we would say, at a large bookstore, but educators could bring it into their classrooms and have a book that's informed by trauma-informed teaching, as we would say in Spanish, valga la redundancia. And at the same time, it also focuses on social-emotional learning. So it is a way to help educators at their intermediate, high school, and also at the college level. For the next time you have to go into your classroom and face your students while they are going through a very traumatic situation, whether it is climate related or not. So it's been a pleasure being part of the project in those two roles.
Thank you so much. That was it reminded me of the role that women, I think, play in our culture in being the storytellers. So thank you again for sharing your story. I do want to remind folks who are joining us in the audience that if you have any questions for any of our two speakers, for any clarifications, please put them in the chat. You can also use the hashtag #Maria and tag Hispanics in Philanthropy as well as Voice of Witness, and we'll do our best to follow up with any of those questions. And of course, as Zaira mentioned, if you're an educator, and I can imagine some of our funders in our audience would also love to kind of dig deeper on Puerto Rico and kind of like what got us here, there is that educational component. You'll be able to find it sometime popping up on the screen. Our tech fairies will do that for us, or in the chat as well, where you'll be able to find a curriculum that was put together based on the narrations of this book. So I just want to start off, I know we did our introductions, but I feel like we also have to talk a little bit about what got us here in terms of Puerto Rico, and talk a little bit more about the hurricane and the historical context. So on September 20th, 2017, Maria devastated Puerto Rico. And as we know, it wasn't just Hurricane Maria, it was also Hurricane Irma that came right along. That was over 200,000 Puerto Ricans that, because of those devastations, were forced to flee the island in search of a roof over their heads, a job, an open school. In the aftermath, over 4,000, and I want to get this number right, 4,645 people died. And that, Dr. Ricia, you were mentioning, is quite a conservative number on the estimates of Harvard. Thousands of people lived without electricity or potable water for months, and close to 60,000, and I'm assuming this is a conservative number as well, 60,000 homes were still roofless 8 months later. But the story of Puerto Rico and Hurricane Maria is not just a story of devastation, as we had mentioned. It's a story of resilience, it's a story of dignity, and it's a story of collective power. In the face of a negligent response by the federal government and local government, people turned to each other for support. Across the island, people organized, forming volunteer brigades to clean up roads, rebuild homes, install solar panels, assemble massive soup kitchens to make sure everyone can eat, and so much more. Out of an unprecedented crisis, people built power and began to craft a new vision for a just recovery. So how did we get here? This crisis wasn't an unprecedented natural disaster. Rather, Hurricane Maria lifted a veil on the impact of disaster capitalism and colonialism, a predatory economy of austerity, structural racism, and climate change. In Puerto Rico, an otherwise natural disaster amped up on climate change steroids slammed into a place that has systemically been stripped of foundational rights and the basic elements of a just economy. So even before this hurricane hit, Puerto Rico and its people were suffering the ravages of a Wall Street-induced debt crisis that left 46% of Puerto Ricans living in poverty, combined with unemployment and a crippled public infrastructure. In response to the debt crisis, the federal government imposed a fiscal control board known as La Junta in Spanish, or more formally the FOMB, the Federal Oversight Management Board, that further removed democratic rights from the people in Puerto Rico. And it instituted a regime of austerity that forced closures of hundreds of public schools, cuts to public pensions, and raised taxes on working class Puerto Ricans. In the months and years after disasters like Maria, we mentioned, the hurricanes, but as we know, and for those of you that don't, I invite you to learn a little bit more, maybe through the curriculum, but there were further earthquakes that hit in the last few years as well that by no means helped the situation. But these disasters hit the most marginalized communities, usually poor communities of color, and that were largely left out of rebuilding initiatives. Too often, the destruction was used by corporations as an opportunity to turn a profit and privatize public services and further displace communities. The same can be said about what is happening in Puerto Rico. In the face of crisis, no comprehensive package has actually covered any of this devastation that has happened. And instead, the government has been pushing for more privatization of electricity, the privatization of schools, higher tuition at public universities, higher taxes for working class Puerto Ricans, and spending cuts of the social safety net. I have to take a pause because, wow, I feel like, and I know you guys are nodding your heads with me, but I feel like as a community, both living in Puerto Rico, those of the diaspora that were forced off the island through different circumstances, and the generations of Puerto Ricans afterwards, which I myself feel very much included in that bucket. I think we're very much hurting for Puerto Rico because in a moment of so much disaster, it feels sometimes bleak and sometimes like we can't take a step back. So I do want to say that in this step back, in this conversation, we are looking at the stories of so many of powerful Puerto Ricans who are able to speak up and speak their truth to power, to talk about the things that we can do and the power that we do have in this moment and beyond. So with that said, I feel like that was a mouthful. I will stop talking. Ricia, Zaira, I want to invite you guys to talk a little bit about, I mentioned this big word, disaster capitalism, and what that exactly means, and in terms of the theme of this book and how that kind of showed up throughout different stories. Ricia, I want to pass the baton to you first.
Thank you very much. I think that you've set a very good stage here, and I'm very appreciative of the work you did to set up this part of the conversation. If we look at the book, we have a testimonial from a lineman who's working on the power lines, and he's been working on the power lines for the power company for years prior to the earthquake and the devastation. And what he's explaining in his narrative is that the hurricane didn't just knock out the power grid, that for the decade leading up to the hurricane, the government cut spending on things such as the trucks that were used to go to locations, to the equipment that people purchased, that people needed to have to repair the lines, that the number of people working for the power crews was cut before the hurricane, that the hazard pay that is very necessary for a person who's going to go out and work on live power lines was cut. He tells that after the hurricane, when he was out with the power crews repairing power lines, his flame retardant protective gear had gaping holes in it. And so we have these examples in the collection of how not just the decade leading up to the hurricane, but the generational times leading up to the hurricane are demonstrative of the fact that colonialism and the position of coloniality is impacting the situation within Puerto Rico and within other marginalized communities, so that when something does happen, people and the systems in place to help are not able to.
Put myself on mute. Sorry about that. Zaira, would you like to add a little bit to that? And I know we were, if I can invite you maybe to speak when we talk about colonialism in the context of a Puerto Rican resident, what that means, living off the island. You have lived both on and off the island, what it means to have sort of those rights living in Puerto Rico and not Okay.
Well, first, I mean, I'm thinking of a few things. And first, as Ricia was mentioning, there are so many stories in the book. And because I worked to develop the curriculum, that I had to read them so many times, right? To get acquainted with the themes. And in terms of disaster capitalism, first and foremost, we have narrators like Vivian, who have lodging places, sort of Airbnb style places. And she tells in her story how every person who came here to buy land. Because as we would say in Puerto Rican Spanish, estaba como carne a bomba, right? So it was so destroyed that people were just trying to get money however they could. And this was a great moment for people who had some extra cash to come in and buy land and buy houses, which of course meant those who were trying to recuperate and those who were left homeless when they were renting or no longer could literally afford to live in their same neighborhood because they discovered it was a flood area, because they discovered the mudslides and said, I'm never returning here. These people who really needed to recuperate and find a spot couldn't find one, couldn't afford one, because people were coming in to buy the real estate. And at least in terms of colonialism, we have ample evidence and we have research studies showing that Puerto Rico did not receive the same treatment from federal agencies when it comes to recovery, meaning the amount of time that it took for any vessel or any chopper, any airplane to be sent to Puerto Rico or authorized to come in, the amount of hurdles that were set in place, because Puerto Rico is, the narrative is Puerto Rico is a corrupt place and whatever money you send will be stolen. Because of those narratives that we see in mainstream media, everything was delayed, meaning it took way longer for people to get the help they needed. And those delays are largely responsible for that number, for the 4,645. It wasn't even Maria, it wasn't even Irma, it was the human-led disaster that came right after it. So certainly there's many ways to look at it. And thinking of that delayed response or the treatment we received from FEMA, it reminds me of Carlo Bonilla's story. And he's a farmer. And he says, don't even get me started on FEMA because I can't think of FEMA. Like I can't think of the process and not feel like crying, because that's how difficult this was. I mean, for you to think that you're living in a place like San Sebastian, the rural communities where the roads are destroyed, they were washed away by rivers, and you're telling them to drive 2 to 3 hours to a coliseum to submit paperwork, and then expect a phone call when there are no telecommunications happening. So certainly was a process of, do I even want to spend the $50 the bank is allowing me to retrieve on gas so I can get there and sit there and lose the whole day when it's raining and there's water coming inside my house? Like, which one do I prioritize? So people had to choose between begging for services and begging for recovery or actually doing the work themselves in their communities. So certainly that's one way to look at how colonialism played out after those disasters.
Thank you. And this also reminded me that, and I, in my personal time, I often have conversations about Puerto Rico. When am I not? I am thinking about just explaining kind of that interdependence that exists. And sorry to mansplain a little bit here, but I think it's important for us to also talk about the Jones Act and the importance of how that affects the everyday lives and the economy in Puerto Rico. So the Jones Act, just a quick paraphrasing, essentially dictates the exports and imports of Puerto Rico, and it is strictly gives the United States access to how we get and receive goods in Puerto Rico. So that means we have to use US ships, which, as you can imagine, like if we want some beans from our neighbors in the Dominican Republic. It first has to stop on US soil and then come to Puerto Rico. So in terms of, Hurricane Maria, I know that act was lifted for a very short period of time. However, the before and the after certainly impacted the way Puerto Ricans were able to just survive, I think, in the wake of the hurricane. And speaking of that, and kind of how those policies in the US affect Puerto Rico as well, I wanted to also bring up a little bit about how, Puerto Ricans are represented, not just in terms of policy, but in, like you mentioned, Zaira, in the media and kind of these narratives that exist about how we receive funds, what happens with them, and also that perception of power, I think, that Puerto Ricans have and here on the island and off. And I know there was a particular narration, his name is missing me at the moment, where he was protecting some of the gas stations. It was the policeman who was protecting some of the gas stations on the island because there was such a shortage and how that impacted kind of everyone else. And I want to say this because there was a moment in his story that really brought me to a pause. And there was a woman who kind of went up to him and was skipping the hours long line that people had to wait for weeks on end because her husband desperately needed gas for his oxygen tanks because he was he suffering from lung cancer. And I think that just goes to show when you have policies like that restrict, imports and exports, something as simple as being able to have your oxygen tank running, something as simple as I think about my grandmother who goes to dialysis a few times a week, getting her to and from those appointments. I think it put a lot of people, in fear. And I don't know if we necessarily always make that connection of how such a big policy can affect us on such a very everyday normal level. But one of the things I wanted you guys to talk about as well was the resiliency of the community, and more than resiliency, I think the community powered efforts that occurred in Puerto Rico that were very much like Ricia, you were mentioning, you just felt like you had to do something. You couldn't just sit here and give your students kind of an assignment and not have them heal from it. How beautiful is that? I wanted to kind of touch a little bit on the stories within Mi Maria that speak of, Puerto Ricanos helping Puerto Ricanos and clearing up pathways, even just to make it out of and to make sure that there were people who were able to talk to each other. So if you guys can speak to us a little bit about that.
Can you hear me, Inaru?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay. In a wonderful example of disaster capitalism, an external company named Luma has taken over the power grid in Puerto Rico. And in the middle of storm season, we are having rolling blackouts that are impacting hospitals and medical care and all sorts of things over the island. And so that's why I keep cutting out because I'm in a rolling blackout at the moment. So please excuse me for that. Inaro, thank you so much for bringing up that example of Rafael Ramos Diaz, who was the police officer in Arecibo. And the reason why the gas had to be protected by armed police escort is because FEMA intercepted all imports of gasoline and food and said, we will decide where this needs to go without consulting mayors of towns without consulting local governments and saying where the need is. So in Raphael's story, he uses the word kidnapping or separating out the gas, that FEMA is kidnapping or taking the gas and saying, this is where we think the gas needs to go. And he also talks about capping the amount of gas you can $20 and official reports saying, well, $20 will fill many gas tanks in a car, and so this will be enough, but not saying we also need gasoline for a generator. We also need gasoline for an oxygen machine. We need gasoline to keep people alive. And to respond to Inara's question, we have the story of Nilda, and Nilda is a woman who committed her life to taking care of her niece with Down syndrome. And at the time of the hurricane, her niece Nereda was bedridden on an oxygen machine. And so first you have the story of the home filling with rushing water. Her neighbor, Tito, bangs on her window and says, Nilda, Nilda, open the door. The water is at my back. And so they come in and they have to carry Nereda upstairs to safety. But then it's months before the electricity is restored. There are no public ambulances available at the time. So Nilda has to go to a private ambulance company and beg people to come to her home to help bring Nereda back downstairs to her own bed. In Luis Flores's narrative, Luis's father needs that dialysis treatment. He's on dialysis every other day. And Luis's narrative talks about sitting on their porch for 5 days as his father misses 3 dialysis treatments. And he has this moment where he has to say, no, Papi, no, you cannot have that glass of water, because a dialysis patient is not supposed to have too much fluids. So in the heat, in the terrible heat after the hurricane, he has to take a glass of water out of his father's hand. But then on the flip side of this, his wife, Brenda, decides she's going to take the children and she's going to take the car and visit a neighbor so that they can have this moment of joy. And at the neighbor's house, the neighbor comes roaring up in her car, screaming, Brenda, Brenda, go home. There's diesel at the dialysis clinic. And then Brenda flies home. She says to her husband, Luis, come on, get your father. And Luis says, okay, but I was running in so many directions, I fell down. And then I got my dad and we got to the dialysis clinic. And so I think you have a really important point here. What do you do when you need electricity to live? What do you do when you have no telephone? When you can't connect with someone else and you can't say the dialysis center is open and it will be open for 1 hour if you get there? And then what happens if you only have enough gas in your car to drive 3 miles? What's the decision you make? What's the phone call you decide on? What's the place you decide to drive? And here we see it one out of many instances in which it's people joining together who help you make those decisions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That is pretty jarring and powerful. I think it very much speaks to the healthcare system in Puerto Rico at that time. And I dare say right now, it makes me think of my dear friend, Frances, who's in doing her residency now in Orlando, but at the time was just beginning her journey as a medical student in Centro, in La UP in Centro Médico, and how difficult it was for students at the time also to want to pitch in and support, and not having the resources and not having yeah, just the resources to kind of make those decisions, to support and still yet they rolled their sleeves up, and there were people who were able to come out. I wanted to transition over to Zaira to talk a little bit about this, another theme that I think underlined the narration of the book, which was the healthcare system in Puerto Rico. And I think I have her name pulled up, Wendy Diaz. Her story was just incredibly powerful because of just a little, I'll let Zaira kind of explain more, but some context on Wendy. She's a disabled mother who was very much living on her own and proudly so, and able to take care of herself. But obviously with any sort of disaster, there's only so much you can do to prepare. And as we've seen through the stories, there was nothing that could prepare us for Hurricane Maria, whether you were on the island or off and disconnected from loved ones, as she was for, I believe it, a few weeks. I think there was families started to kind of been able to get outside contact a few weeks right after the hurricane. But Zaira, if you can just speak to us a little bit about Wendy and how she kind of navigated the healthcare system in Puerto Rico at the time.
I mean, talk about a perfect example of strength. I mean, Wendy, I mean, hats off to Wendy. You think of someone, right, with functional diversity, and you think of someone who's stuck to a wheelchair that's electronic, which means it needs electricity. And the ramp to her house is blocked by a gigantic tree or palm tree. I can't remember which one exactly. And of course, she is trapped in her home, unable to get out. And you have the community coming in and taking that wheelchair and charging it and bringing it back up, even before anyone is able to cut that tree. But I think, at least from Wendy's story, there are so many things. For example, in addition to being tied to the chair, she also has other underlying conditions. So she needs to care about her dietary intake. And we all know in Puerto Rico that the food we were getting, if we can call it food, the provisions we were getting were all, I remember getting like a whole box of Butterfingers, like little tubs of Pringles, beef jerky. And you're wondering if it's someone who can't handle sodium, who needs to have a specific intake of food. They can't eat this. And then you had even people with the best intentions putting together a ton of rice and beans, which is a traditional plate in Puerto Rico, right? Arroz, habichuela, y carne. And it's still ridden with sodium and carbohydrates. So if you are tied to your chair and there are all these needs you have for food, you can't find food in a supermarket. And if those of us who are, I would say, typically developing and have our fully working legs, and we were struggling. Imagine someone who also has trouble with her upper strength and her legs, because in her case, she also had trouble with her upper body. Yet despite all that, Wendy was the community person to go to if you needed someone to supervise your kids for a little while. I mean, she had experience as an educator, and Wendy was welcoming all the neighborhood kids to come in so she could teach them math, so she could teach them how to play dominoes, because she knew parents were so busy and needed so much help. So you have this individual sacrifice and an example of strength. And what Ricia and you were mentioning, all this coordination that took place without email blasts, without any kind of phone call. It was a come here and we'll talk, or we'll leave each other a note. Businesses were using spray cans and graffiti in their own windows and their own doors. This is how we were communicating. And then you think of examples like Emmanuel. Oh my goodness, Emmanuel in Mayagüez with his wife who went into labor during the hurricane. And him trying the lose battle of getting out of the house and realizing there is no way. I mean, bawling and crying, coming back to a woman in labor, screaming because the baby is coming and he can't do anything. Yet the next time he goes out, a pickup truck and a few all-terrain vehicles just honk their horns and say, follow us, she's with us. They found a nurse, someone found a nurse, someone found someone with an ATV, another person found someone who had a pickup truck. They located the pregnant woman, put her in the truck, and drove her to the hospital. The thing he could have never been able to do on his own, the community was able to do because he asked around. So there's certainly that element of how dire this was for everyone because it all collapsed. There was no health system running, not really. I mean, the hospitals were closed, as Ricia mentioned in the beginning, in the Aguadilla example, but you also have all this ingenuity of community of saying, okay, well, we know what we don't have, but this is what we have. And based on our own community assessment, this person knows something about nursing. This person has a truck, that person has a generator. How about we just, help each other? And that's how we pulled forward. That is how it happened.
That reminds me of I chuckled a bit because I love El Mesón. And one of the stories I mentioned that El Mesón is a fast food restaurant that sells very quick sandwiches, but very like Puerto Rican-esque bakery. Like they have quesitos, orillitos. You guys know what I'm talking about. Those are corn fritters and baked Puerto Rican baked goods. But they were one of the businesses alongside, I think in Vivian's story, she's from, I think, Mayagüez, the West Coast region. One of her stories is she kind of reached out, one of her clients in her wellness business were folks from El Mesón, and they partnered together to bring sandwiches, prepare sandwiches in Mayagüez, in their Mayagüez location. They shut down the entire restaurant. They, had thousands of sandwiches go out, and she was like that epicenter to get supplies out and food and fresh, good food that people deserve. And that was, I think, a powerful story in talking about just like the food that we're receiving of the Chef Boyardee and beans, and which is fine, but not great for. This wasn't just a weekend. This was weeks and weeks and weeks where people had to, and to this day that people still are trying to recover. That said, thank you. I want to encourage folks who are listening on, again, to join the conversation using the hashtag #MeMaria, @BeHipGive, @VoiceOfWitness, and also to put questions in the chat. We want to make sure we're getting any of your questions. And with that, we do have one question that came in. All of the stories are so powerful. How did you possibly choose which stories to include with so many submissions? I believe, Dr. Chansky, that question might be for you, so I will pass the mic over there.
Yeah, that's a great question. And when I was conceptualizing this project, I thought, well, there are 78 municipios, and so I'll have 78 stories. And this was in the moment of the aftermath of disaster as I'm trying to shape this project. And then somebody finally asked me, well, how many pages do you think will actually be in one book? And there was no way that 78 municipios could go in one book. And so we really tried to work as hard as we could to think about some different factors that were really important to us. So one of them is geography. So Puerto Rico is this incredibly magical, special place that has this wide range of geographies. I think sometimes people only focus on coast, that there's a lot of coastal region, but we have this amazing mountainous interior that is just phenomenal. And then Puerto Rico is an archipelago with several islands and cays, and we tend to think of sort of the main island of Puerto Rico first, and not always thinking about the island municipalities of Vieques and Culebra. And so it was really important that we did field work in the mountains, and we invited folks in the interior to share stories. It was very important to us that we also went to the two island municipios, and we did wind up focusing on Culebra. In addition to that, we wanted to hear stories from people with different ages. So, for example, Shania is a college student who was a very young person at the time of the hurricane, and we really wanted to hear her story. But Ramon is an older person who is living in a retirement home, and so we wanted to hear that story. We also wanted to hear some stories from Área Metro, and we focus on the La Perla neighborhood of San Juan. But we also wanted to hear rural stories from people in places that aren't as metropolitan. And then we wanted to hear stories from people whose lived experiences were very different. So Inaru mentioned Wendy. Wendy has some very severe mobility issues. And so her experience in the hurricane is going to be different from somebody else's experience. And so what we tried to do, and it was absolutely heartbreaking to have to make some of these decisions. What we tried to do was we tried to gather together stories that might give us a sense of multiple different experiences from age, from gender, from geographic location, from life experience.
Thank you. That's a great question. I can't even imagine having to have some of those conversations with folks, especially as a storyteller. So we are kind of getting close to the hour. And I wanted to just say thank you again. I keep thanking you guys because I just feel so honored that you guys took the time from step one of just even a classroom assignment to now having this book published and being able to, you know, share it with so many different audiences. I wanted to make sure that I gave you space to share any closing remarks that you might have, any takeaways that you would love our audiences to hear, and then after that, I want to speak a little bit about some actions and steps that our audience can take today. You know, sometimes we feel this is such a big issue, and how can we help? How can little old me, you know, take a step? But we have some quick answers for you, and we'll also provide that in the chat as well. So, Zaira, I want to kind of go to you if there's any one last, you know, sentiment that you'd like to impart on our audience today.
I guess it's about opening your mind and your ears to learning of what the actual experience of the archipelago is. So the book is really an invitation to do that, is an invitation to learn about Puerto Rico. It's the kind of book that anyone who loves the Caribbean or says, I love Puerto Rico, anyone from the diaspora, anyone from the mainland who is not first or second or third generation Puerto Rican, you are a member of this planet, meaning you're going through the same climate change issues that we are going through. And if not the same ones, trust me, you have your own. Like the fires in California, the pipes freezing in the southern areas in the States, the northeastern storms that you're getting now during the summer. So certainly there is a space for us to think on how we are all connected and how we should work with one another to overcome what's coming and what's happening. Not what's going to happen in the future, what's already happening.
Thank you, Dr. Chansky.
Thank you. Echo everything that the brilliant Zaira just said, but just to emphasize a point, you know, we had massive government level failures after Hurricane Maria on both the federal and local level. And the people in our communities stood up and they became heroes. But the second heroes here were the people in the diaspora, who, when they saw what was going on and they saw these massive failures happening, organized and said, I will not forget about home. And we are grateful for that, and it has to continue. It has to continue because some of the colonial practices in Puerto Rico say that the people of Puerto Rico who have been US citizens since 1917 cannot vote for president, do not have voting representation in the US Congress. And so if you are living in the state, you are a voter. And as a voter, think about the people in Puerto Rico who have no representation and need your help when it comes to voting. Thank you.
I love a good call to action for civic duty. And with that, I'm going to go through a little bit on the list the book provides, which I love. I think it was one of my favorite parts of just things we can do right now, you know, like actually making it relevant to our lives. So number one is we heard how climate change has affected Puerto Rico and certainly all across the US and the world. So take action against climate change. You can call your congressional folks. You can work on a community level, working with local groups who are figuring out ways to make this earth a little more livable. And how to take care of it a little more. The second is contact the Department of Homeland Security. It is the department in the US that oversees FEMA, who oversees emergency assistance. In this case, was a bit negligent, to say the least, with the response. So contact them and ask about their disaster readiness plan and figure out ways that we can advocate to make it a little tighter so that those in the future don't have to suffer the same consequences. Number three is contact, back to the civic duty, contact your local congressperson, your, you know, on this, not just on the federal level, but also on the local level, and demand equal voting rights for all. Number four is contacting the U.S. Committee of Natural Resources to call for an end to the austerity measures by the Fiscal Control Board. It was that Fiscal Control Board enacted under the Promesa bill, I think back in 2008, 9. Please do not take my word on that year. But demand for, oh, go ahead. Yes, interrupt me. Yes.
May 2017 Fiscal Oversight and Management Board was put into place. September 2017, the hurricane happened.
Thank you for that very, very useful context. That was off by quite a few years. So demand that they, you know, treat the policies that affect Puerto Ricans a little bit better and to not implement such deep austerity measures. Number five is organize a fund or collect goods to donate to families still in need. There's plenty of organizations in Puerto Rico that are more than willing to cooperate and help just to help our communities. Number six is volunteer. There's a couple of examples in the book, so I'll encourage you to reach out and get the book so you can find some of those examples there. Number seven is participate in socially responsible tourism. Remember that there is still a pandemic. There's layered crises that happened after Hurricane Maria, and we want to be respectful of those still living there. 8 is attend educational exchanges with the UPR system. That's the University of Puerto Rico. And they'll have plenty of educational opportunities to learn. Number 9 is learn some Spanish. Participate in a Puerto Rican pen pal program. And number 10 is contribute your English language skills to community centers. There's a lot of community centers in the US that work directly with displaced families after Hurricane Maria and Hurricane Irma. They're still working to make sure that families are safe, secure, and that we do have a just recovery. With that said, I just want to say thank you again. You'll be able to find the book, Mi María Surviving the Storm, Voices from Puerto Rico, edited by Ricia Anchansky and Marcy Deniswick. I hope I said that right. It's a great book. Find the link below, and I hope you'll join our conversation. We all have the book. We'll join our conversation online as well. Thank you. Thank you, Zaira. Thank you, Ricia. It was an honor to have you guys join us today.